We are live, sir.
Thank you. Thanks, sir.
We're good to go now. Ladies and gentlemen, at the outset, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which we have gathered here today in person. And I want to pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. My name is Dr. Ashutosh Krishna, and I am the CEO of the Institute for Australia, India, and Global. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on which part of the world you are joining us from, virtually, and also here in person. And how really delightful it is that we can now gather and meet in person for such events. And this event is also going live on our Facebook page. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, which is commemorating 75 years of India's independence. And we are very proud to be part of this watershed celebrations. On behalf of IAIT, I want to thank the Indian High Commission Canberra and the Government of India for partnering with us to host this event. With the same token, I also thank the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for their support and also collaborating with us. Similarly, our institutional partners, OT Jindal Global University in India, News, also deserve our accolades for joining hands with us for this another stimulating event. Ladies and gentlemen, this is one of the many events being organized by the Indian High Commission around the world to commemorate Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav or 75th years of India's independence. Today we have a very outstanding panel of distinguished presenters who will be speaking on various aspects of the topic today, that is, role of constitutional democracies in shaping the emerging world order. We have esteemed presenters here with us today joining, who have written extensively on various aspects of this topic. Indo-Pacific, Australia and India's constitutional characteristics, Australia and India cooperation, the stratagem in the Indo-Pacific and India's constitutional journey. Ladies and gentlemen, today is 26th November. It is being celebrated in India as the Constitution Day. Although the Constitution came into force on 26 January 1950, it was on this day, which is 26 November 1949, that the Constitution was adopted. And when it was adopted, it replaced the Government of India Act of 1935 and Independence Act of 1947. India struggled to get a constituent assembly established was being made since the 1930s in a protest against Simon Commission. And by then, the British were convinced that nothing short of granting rights to Indian nationalists to draft the constitution would satisfy them. And this is how the constitution was adopted on 26 November 1949, and finally it came into force on 26 January 1950, which is the Republic Day of India. Ladies and gentlemen, also 26/11 or 26 November is also etched in India's memory and of liberal democracies around the world, because on this fateful day, 10 terrorists of the Lashkar-e-Toiba from across the border unleashed 3 days of mayhem and bloodshed across Mumbai city. This was a brazen attack on India's democracy, freedom, and liberal ethos, killing 175 people, including 2 Australians, Douglas Marty and Red Taylor. That is why 26 November has also become synonymous with fighting against evil forces and ideology that does not believe in democratic ethos and rights and freedoms. Similarly, today the world is also passing through a critical transition when the liberal democracies around the world realize that they need to defend principles of democracy, freedom, civil liberties, to build a stable, secure, transparent, and rule-based order in the Indo-Pacific. The concept of democracies, or the G10, has been diligently working in concert to build a rule-based order here in the Indo-Pacific. And it is in this context the Australia-India strategic partnership and the Quad becomes a critical talk in the Indo-Pacific. To discuss some of these aspects, today we have Mr. Sunil Mehta, the Indian Deputy High Commissioner from Canberra, Mr. Ian Biggs, Australia's Deputy High Commissioner in New Delhi, Mr. Michael Feller, Director, India Political Section, North and South Asia Division, DFAT from Canberra, Ms. Lalita Kumar Mangalam, former chairperson of the National Commission for Women in India, Dr. Yogesh Joshi, research fellow at the Institute for South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. And in person, alongside me, we have Mrs. Archana Singh, the Honorary Council President of India, and also Professor Sean Starr, who is the Director of Center for India-Australia Studies of the Gender Global University, and also a board member of the Institute for Australia and Bangalore. I would request the two speakers to kindly stick to 10 minutes time limit so that we can also take some questions and answers in the end. I also want to thank each one of you for coming here in person and also all our attendees who are joining us virtually. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, it is now my profound pleasure to invite the Honorary Council of India, Mrs. Archana Singh, to kindly deliver her welcome remarks. But before that, I quickly want to introduce her to you. She was appointed the Honorary Council of India for Queensland in November 2011. She holds a BA in History from Lebu Sri Ram College, New Delhi, and in History from St. Stephen's College. She also has a Bachelor of Law from Queensland Institute of Technology, Brisbane. She has been a Hindi language tutor at the Institute for Modern Languages of the University of Queensland in 1987 and 2014. Mr. Archana Singh and a partner, Dr. Vagesh Singh, have got 3 daughters and 2 beautiful grandchildren. She has been Public Relations Manager with the Indian Consulate in Brisbane from 2003 until 2011. During these years, she has engaged with students in the migrant community and multiple programs. She is a very active member of the Consulate. This is Archana. Yes.
Thank you, Ashutosh. Namaste, all friends joining this wonderful seminar in Brisbane with us and also in India and virtually from Canberra as well. Namaste, everyone. I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. As India celebrates 75 years of independence, or Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, we take stock. And we celebrate the many achievements that India has made under its constitution and its democratic system of government. I acknowledge the Deputy High Commissioner of India in Australia, Mr. Sunil Mehta, Deputy High Commissioner of Australia in India, Mr. Ian Biggs, Mr. Michael Feller, Ms. Lalita Kumar Mangalam, Professor Yogesh Joshi, Professor Sean Starr, and Dr. Ashutosh Mishra for the very gracious and erudite participation this morning. So welcome to the seminar, The Role of Constitutional Democracies in Shaping the Emerging World Order. The hallmarks of a democracy are defined by the fact that citizens have both rights and duties. And the principles of governance allow for opportunities where citizens can make an impact on the kind of society that they want to live in. By that very definition, therefore, democracies are organic in nature, reflective of the evolving social and cultural institutions. Both India and Australia are governed by parliamentary democracies, where the rule of law, free and fair elections for a responsible and representative government, the separation of powers, and rights of citizens are a strong feature of both constitutions. More importantly, political institutions in both countries operate within the boundaries of democratic ideals of justice, liberty, equality, and social responsibility. Amongst the many things India and Australia have in common, the underpinnings of their parliamentary democracies are the glue that bind the two countries the most. And of course, the love of cricket is the icing on the cake. The issues that humanity faces, the world, today are increasingly assuming proportions that defy borders. There is an increasing realization that a concerted effort is needed by all to make any difference. It is therefore only natural that the constitutional democracies of the world gravitate towards one another through their shared values and principles of governance. So here we are, friends. You listen to many, many wonderful speakers, and I thank you all for attending.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ashna ji, for the wonderful remarks. And now, may I invite India's Deputy High Commissioner in Canberra, Mr. Sunit Mehta. Mr. Sunit Mehta belongs to the Indian Foreign Service, which is the central service of the Government of India. He holds a degree of Bachelor of Commerce. He is also a chartered accountant and a company secretary. He has served for 14 years in various postings in Indian embassies around the world. He has also served in various locations in Europe and the United Nations. He has served in India's embassies in Madrid, in Washington, and other places. Presently, as I said, he is the Deputy High Commissioner in Canberra, and Mr. Mehta is very fluent, apart from Hindi and English, also in Spanish. Mr. Mehta, take it away, please.
Thank you so much. Just wanted to check, are you able to hear me?
Yes, yes, loud and clear.
Great, thank you. Namaskar to all. Good afternoon to Dr. Ashutosh Mishra, CEO of Institute of Australia-India Engagement, Mrs. Archana Singh, Honorary Consul of India in Queensland, Michael Feller, Director, India Political Section in DFAT, and good morning to my colleague Ian Biggs, Deputy High Commissioner of Australia and India, Professor Yogesh Joshi, Ms. Lalita Kumar Manglam, Professor Sean Starr. At the outset, I would like to thank Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Institute of Australia-India Engagement, and Honorary Consul of India for giving me this opportunity to participate at today's webinar being held on Constitution Day of India and in commemoration of 75 years of Indian independence. I commend them for organizing this event as part of Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. Today, 26th November, is a historical day. 72 years ago, we duly adopted our great constitution. Great luminaries like Dr. Rajendra Prasad, Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, Pandit Nehru, Acharya Kripalani, Maulana Azad, and several other senior leaders gave us this heritage. I pay my tributes to all those who were responsible for giving us this constitution. The Indian Constitution, as you may know, is more than a just set of articles and schedules. It represents our hopes and aspirations, an ideal of the society that we are striving to be. As we work towards realizing the dream of New India, the principles enshrined in the Constitution have become even more relevant. The concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the world is one family, is central to our Constitution and civilizational ethos. This places upon us the responsibility of being responsible global citizens. We have long been a constructive actor in the international system by sharing our developmental experience with partner countries, undertaking humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations from the Pacific to the Atlantic, assisting many of our friends during the pandemic through initiatives like International Solar Alliance, Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, and the recently launched Infrastructure for Resilient Island States. Vaccine Maitri, a global health diplomacy initiative, helped in supply of made in India vaccines to nations across the world. India has undertaken the world's largest vaccination drive, administering around 1.2 billion doses, is a proof of our belief and strength. We have delivered on Prime Minister's promise to make 70 million doses of Indian manufactured vaccines accessible to the world. Vaccine Maitri came after our supply of essential medicines to 150 countries by overcoming the daunting challenges of the pandemic. India is one of the leading maritime security providers in the oceanic neighborhood. We are active in anti-piracy operations, work with partners to enhance our maritime domain awareness and information capacities systems. The fundamental spatial orientation of our policy remains neighborhood first. Initiatives such as BIMSTEC link neighborhood first to another fundamental pillar of our policies, which is Act East. We have a growing dialogue with ASEAN through multiple channels. Our engagement with Africa has intensified as never before. Over 2/3 of India's line of credit has been offered to African countries. We are committed multilateralists. We are committed to a rule-based international order. India is currently in the UN Security Council for a non-permanent tenure. We are having the BRICS chair. We will chair the G20 in 2023. Our development assistance, deploying around 31 billion US dollars in lines of credit and 8 billion in grants, is a very good example of our partnership with the countries. Our development journey can offer many templates, whether it be in digital connectivity, financial inclusion. India has the scale, and many of the solutions which we have put it out in the domain, like the CoWIN platform, are available to the entire humanity. Now, India and Australia are key partners in Indo-Pacific. As vibrant and pluralistic democracies with shared values, our nations have collectively affirmed the importance of maintaining a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. We remain committed to upholding the rules-based international order, underpinned by the rule of law, transparency, freedom of navigation in international seas, respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty, and peaceful resolution of disputes. The Virtual Leaders Summit in June 2020 was a milestone in the India-Australia bilateral relations, and as both nations agreed to elevate their relationship to comprehensive strategic partnership. 11 years after forging the strategic partnership in 2009. Honorable Prime Ministers of India and Australia have met several times during the last few years, including the recent ones in Washington and Glasgow. Our comprehensive strategic partnership is a reflection of broad ties between India and Australia and provides the vision for the future growth. The first 2+2 Foreign and Defense Ministerial Dialogue held in New Delhi in September is an important milestone. It reflects the growing strategic convergence between like-minded democracies. Both are committed towards free, open, prosperous, and rules-based Indo-Pacific region. We have seen an intensification of cooperation in maritime domain. Both sides agreed to move forward on low emissions technology partnership with a focus on hydrogen and ultra low cost solar. Our complementarities on critical and strategic minerals is a win-win. We're working on resilient supply chains for critical and strategic minerals. India and Australia are also exploring collaboration on clean energy technologies. Cooperation on cybersecurity, innovation, digital economy, cyber and critical technologies are essential pillars. We are re-engaged on achieving comprehensive economic cooperation agreement by December 2022, and in an interim and early harvest agreement by this year. The timelines are ambitious, but as we speak, our negotiators are negotiating on the tariff lines. Our Quad agenda covers vaccines, climate change, emerging technologies, which makes Quad a global force for the good. As Honorable Prime Minister recently said in the Sydney Dialogue, it is essential for democracies like India and Australia to work together, to invest together in research and development in future technologies, to develop trusted manufacturing bases and trusted supply chains, to deepen intelligence and operational cooperation on cybersecurity, protect critical information infrastructure, prevent manipulation of public opinions, develop technical and global governance standards consistent with our democratic values, and create standards and norms for data governance and for cross-border flow that protect and secure data. So India and Australia have a great partnership to pursue in coming days as well. Today is also the anniversary of the horrific assault on democratic freedom. The Mumbai terror attack, which occurred 13 years ago, are forever etched in India's collective memory when 166 innocent lives were lost, including 2 Australians, and another 300 were injured. Terrorism remains the single biggest threat to international peace and security, and India and Australia, who stand for democracy, constitutionalism, and human rights, must jointly fight against this menace. I would once again thank the organizers for giving me this wonderful opportunity to participate at today's webinar, and to the participants for their patient hearing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mehta, for such a comprehensive presentation. You covered so much in 10 minutes. It's commendable. And you're very rightly recognized India's stellar role in the world, that it has been playing in various international fora, and also the kind of role India has played during the COVID, the testing times that the world has witnessed, how we have reached out to 135 countries with all kinds of assistance. India's leadership in the world and presence has been widely recognized. Thank you so much for that. Ladies and gentlemen, now it's my profound pleasure to kindly invite our next speaker, the second keynote speaker, that is Mr. Ian Biggs from New Delhi. Mr. Ian Biggs is Australia's Deputy High Commissioner and was appointed to the Deputy High Commissioner for India in July 2021. He's a senior career officer at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and had earlier served as Australia's ambassador to some very challenging places, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and he was also charged to do affairs in Baghdad. Mr. Biggs has also served as the head of Secretariat International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, and was on secondment as Special Assistant to the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency. Mr. Biggs has an extensive experience with the department and also in the Office of National Assistance. And he has been posted overseas in Austria, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. Mr. Biggs holds a Bachelor of Arts degree and double honors from the University of Sydney and Master of Arts degree in International Relations from the Australian National University. Mr. Biggs, it's a profound pleasure to invite you and have you with us. All yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ishwar. It's a pleasure to talk on India's Constitution Day and its 75th year of independence on a topic that I know of great interest to both our prime ministers. As Prime Minister Morrison said at the Observer Research Foundation's Racina Dialogue in April, Australians and Indians are free people. We're constitutional democracies built on respect and responsibility for the dignity and aspirations of our people. In September, on a much larger stage, the United Nations General Assembly, Prime Minister Modi reflected on the success of India's 75 years of democracy. This success is the culmination of thousands of years of democratic traditions. Our Prime Minister's personal rapport is built on this shared appreciation of democracy. Coincidentally, 3 years ago, we had an almost simultaneous re-election of governments headed by these two leaders. This allowed our prime ministers to get straight back into business with renewed vigour and a popular mandate for the bilateral relationship. Our democracies, as represented by our parliaments and governments, are true partners. We see the world in this vital respect in the same way. Despite the significant differences of scale and process between our electoral systems, the feat of democracy is truly celebrated by people in both our countries. In Australia, we have a tradition of a democracy sausage sizzle, which creates a carnival atmosphere at the voting booth on election day. Deputy High Commissioner Mehta, I look forward to hearing of your experiences early next year, whipping up a barbecue to the background hum of ballots being counted. Here in India, the rallies and roadshows and rolling electoral schedule build a sense of excitement that cascades across the country, the festival of democracy. I know High Commissioner Farrell is itching to get out and witness such rallies in the upcoming state elections in India. It's easy to make light of these festivities, but what they show is the strength of democratic values in each of our political cultures. Far across the Indo-Pacific, it's these values that tie us together and underline our shared vision for the kind of world we want to see. To quote Prime Minister Modi at the Shangri-La Dialogue in 2018, in the same speech where he articulated his vision for the Indo-Pacific, it's the ideals of democracy that define us as nations and shape the way we engage with the world. As democracies, we want a world where the rule of law prevails over might is right politics, a world free of coercion and intimidation. We believe in the importance of maintaining and benefiting from diversity and are committed to promoting values of tolerance and pluralism continuously. How we view the world matters for how we engage with the world. It's natural then for like-minded democracies to undertake practical cooperation based on their foundational shared values. This is an approach we share with India. As External Affairs Minister Jaishankar has argued in the past, there is a strategic imperative to democracies working together. We are more comfortable with people who approach governing and consensus building in a similar way. And in a similar vein, might I add, we are more comfortable absorbing and including those with whom we may not always agree on every issue. Minister Jaishankar recognizes this too in his recent book, The India Way, saying India is inherently comfortable with pluralism given its own internal diversity. It's not surprising then that India and Australia fit so comfortably together in the Quad. The Quad is an important grouping involving 4 like-minded democracies committed to supporting the principles they believe in. It's an important tool for dialogue and for us to respond collectively and swiftly to the most pressing challenges facing the region. Through the Quad, we are working together to promote an inclusive, positive agenda for the Indo-Pacific. This positive and practical agenda shows our regional partners they have our strong support. But also Australia and India have consolidated separate trilateral consultative mechanisms with Japan, Indonesia, and France, 3 vibrant Indo-Pacific democracies. Working with these 3 countries is vital to building regional architecture and cooperation in support of our shared Indo-Pacific interests. Through these trilateral mechanisms, we are developing coordinated approaches on issues vital to the region, including supply chains, the blue economy, and multilateral institutions. Democracies working together has only become more important in an increasingly volatile world. The COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated many of the concerning trends we already faced in the Indo-Pacific, indeed globally. These include rising tensions over sovereignty, whether in the South China Sea or high in the Himalayas. The use of grey zone tactics and disinformation has been increasing, and there have been challenges to establish rules and norms in ways that concern all countries, whether large or small. Internally, too, we recognize that our systems are not faultless. Many of the regional issues intersect with internal challenges to democracy, including the misuse of new technologies, risks of disinformation, and terrorism. Other challenges to which we must adapt include the distorting impact of social media on information, increasing polarization, and the rising cost of elections. The beauty of democracy is how it confronts change and challenges. In the words of US Secretary of State Blinken during his visit to New Delhi in July, every democracy is a work in progress. We are all on a quest for a more perfect union. Like High Commissioner Farrell, who likes to draw on his former life on the democratic front lines as a politician, I'm a big believer in self-correcting democracies. The past 2 years of pandemic, protest, and polarization bring to life Tocqueville's insight that while democracy reveals its shortcomings at first sight, its strengths are always revealed at length. The ability to correct mistakes, to reflect the popular will, and to protect plural consensus is what makes constitutional democracy special. The voters are never wrong, to quote High Commissioner O'Farrell. And the wonderful thing about democracies is that they're not static. In Australia, we continually make changes to our electoral system to be more inclusive, representative, and transparent. From implementing the secret ballot from our very first federal election in 1901, to beginning to extend the right to vote in federal elections to women the following year, to introducing compulsory voting in the 1920s, all the way through to changes to our system of distributing preferences in the last several years. Throughout this perennial adaptation, it's a constitutional democratic framework that grounds us with a principled stability. For Australia and India, our constitutions guide our approach to changing times and anchor us in the spirit of our nation's founding ethos. Nowhere is this more evident than in India's constitution, one of the most remarkable legal and social documents in history. It's the constitution that guarantees voting opportunity to every citizen. It's the constitution that requires Australia and India to go to incredible lengths to ensure that we all have a say, whether we're on isolated islands, in scorched deserts, or even overseas. I marvel at the Indian Election Commission's efforts, for example, to set up a polling booth for a single voter in the forest mountains of Arunachal Pradesh, or the teams that hike high into the Himalayas near Ladakh carrying voting machines and oxygen cylinders for the altitude. This capacity for renewal, for dynamism, for adjustments and inclusion anchored in a set of laws. These are fundamental to the Indo-Pacific of the future. It's vital then that Australia and India continue to uphold and celebrate our fundamental democratic values. Democracy is one of the relentless forces that brings India and Australia together. Our Commissioner Farrell talks of the 4 Ds that are the foundation of our relationship: defence, diaspora, dosti, and most importantly for our approach to the world, democracy. We're both strong, vibrant, secular, multicultural, constitutional democracies. Our shared democratic values and rule of law underline our collective vision for the world, a world better served by respecting all individual sovereign states, working together to uphold an inclusive, open, and rules-based system. To return to Prime Minister Modi's speech at the UN General Assembly, democracy can deliver, democracy has delivered. In the emerging world order, Australia is proud to partner with India, the largest democracy of them all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Mr. Biggs, for your, again, very fascinating presentation. And I must say this, that you have, again, like the previous speaker, your counterpart, you have covered, again, a wide array of issues, starting from the characteristics of Australia's constitution, its constitutional journey, and also how Australia and India have been cooperating over the years as a part of their strategic partnership, and also in highlighting the challenges that the liberal democracies face in the Indo-Pacific. And these are some of the very challenging issues that not only Australia and India, but liberal democracies around the world face. So thank you very, very much for your very comprehensive and very sharp remarks, Mr. Biggs. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, now it's my profound pleasure to now invite Mr. Michael Feller. Mr. Michael Feller is the Director, India Political Section, North and South Asia Division in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He was previously Senior Advisor, South and Southeast Asia in DFAT and Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. And he's also been advisor to Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. He was earlier posted to Singapore, and prior to joining the Australian Public Service, Mr. Feller was a senior journalist and financial analyst. He holds a Bachelor of Honors from Monash University and Master of Arts in International Relations from Deakin University. Mr. Feller, it's a profound pleasure to invite you to share your remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, and I hope you can hear me. This is the first time I've used this particular computer for a Zoom call, so you can hear me. Great. Look, colleagues, friends, fellow panelists, I would like to thank first the Institute for Australia-India Engagement for bringing us together, both in person and virtually. It is, as the other panelists have said, a special honour to be speaking to commemorate India's Constitution Day, but also a day when we do remember the victims of the 26/11 Mumbai attacks, which was an attack like 9/11 on all constitutional democracies and all free people, not just on the city of Mumbai. Friends, Australia and India share a special bond. Our friendship is based on shared values and an outlook, an open economic and political system, and an interest in maintaining a region that is governed by rules, not by power. As Ian said, not by being the biggest, not by might, but based on constitutionality. And this system, our shared democracy, we have made great strides despite the challenges of COVID-19. In our bilateral relationship under the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, this relationship has never been stronger. This year in September, we held our inaugural Foreign and Defence Ministers 2+2 meeting, which marked a historic milestone in the relationship. officials in both India and Australia are stepping up to provide tangible outcomes to deliver a shared vision for an open, free and rules-based region. And as Sunit said, we are pursuing an ambitious agenda on trade, data and clean technology. But not only are Australia and India closely aligned through shared democratic traditions and strong bilateral ties, but there is a much deeper foundation to this relationship, and that's of the people. We're natural partners in the Indo-Pacific. We're both cultures which thrive on debate and discussion, as Ian put it, and whether that's through the democracy sausage here or the democratic festivals that characterize elections in India. Our values are fundamentally aligned on the promotion of peace and advancing and protecting democratic values. And the values we share have paved the way for a shared vision for the future of our region. Reflecting on India's fundamental national values, the core tenets of constitutional democracy remain vibrant in India's diplomacy and its global agenda. Internationally, we are seeing a steady increase in Indian-led institutions. For example, there's the International Solar Alliance, the Coalition for Disaster Resilience Infrastructure, and with Australia, the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative Partnership. These organisations highlight strong support for the sustainment of an international rules-based order. The International Solar Alliance is India's first treaty-based organisation and a priority of Prime Minister Modi. It represents a major international investment by India's government. It provides a dedicated platform for cooperation among solar resource-rich countries through which the global community, including bilateral and multilateral organisations, can contribute. Likewise, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, another personal initiative of Prime Minister Modi, brings together international coalition of countries, UN agencies and other multilateral and private sector bodies to promote disaster resilient infrastructure. And finally, the IPOI reinforces Australia and India as democratic partners. It shapes maritime cooperation in the Indo-Pacific to support an open, inclusive, resilient, prosperous and rules-based maritime order. These are just 3 instances of India's strong democratic values paving the way for broader regional and international cooperation. And these, of course, are things that Australia is very keen, as a fellow like-minded democracy, to support. Democracies are essential to strengthening a rules-based, transparent and stable Indo-Pacific region. Cooperation between India and Australia in this regards is likewise essential. At an international and regional level, our joint support for democratic institutions is confirmation of our value alignment. Australia welcomes India's increased tempo and depth of engagement in regional and multilateral institutions, noting a focus on candidacies and standard-setting bodies. It is reflected through India and Australia's engagement in ASEAN. As like-minded partners, we must continue to align our approaches in ASEAN forums to ensure that we can provide Southeast Asian countries, including fellow Southeast Asian democracies, with a strategic space to discourage coercion. We must also, India and Australia, continue to cooperate to advance the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. Our collaboration in the Indian Ocean region, including through the Quad and our trilateral cooperation with France and Indonesia, are supporting the protection of a regional maritime security order under international law. I'm pleased that Australia could support India's voice on the international stage by providing reciprocal support for a number of candidacies in recent months. Most recently, we have supported India in the Universal Postal Union, the International Maritime Organization, and the UN Human Rights Council. By supporting like-minded leadership, we can safeguard democratic institutions for the world. So Australia is keen to continue working closely with India as a fellow mature democracy in its 75th year to ensure international law and standard-setting bodies are protected across the world and specifically in the Indo-Pacific. Again, we are natural partners in the Indo-Pacific region. Our communities are deeply connected. most visibly through the 700,000 odd Australians of Indian descent, and our democratic values continue to be closely aligned. As India marks its 75th year of independence in 2022, we should all be very proud of our bilateral ties moving from strength to strength. Our countries are working together through these shared values to realise the opportunities our region offers to respond to the challenges that we face. That's all for me. Thank you again, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the panel.
Thank you very much, Michael. Once again, everyone will agree that it's yet another very rich and comprehensive presentation. And I must also share that the view with you that India-Australia relations are currently at a historic high, which was also highlighted by High Commissioner Barry O'Farrell in New Delhi last year. And that is why I believe that right now you in the India political section have that huge opportunity to take the relationship to a much higher level. And what is very encouraging is that our bilateral relationship, Australia-India bilateral relationship, cannot be seen in isolation from the strategic relationship. And this has not been the case like 10 years ago. But this is the case today. So if our bilateral relationship deepens, it further helps our strategic relationship and vice versa. And you very rightly pointed how Australia and India are already cooperating at the strategic level, at the bilateral level, and also at international fora. So thank you very, very much again, Michael, for your very lucid and sharp presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, on the program we had Ms. Lalita Kumar Mangalam, but she's currently facing some technical issues at her end. She'll come later at the end of the program. So right now, I would like to now invite Dr. Yogesh Joshi. Dr. Yogesh Joshi is a research fellow at the Institute for South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. He focuses on contemporary Indian foreign and national security policy. He has written extensively on Indo-Pacific balance of power, evolution of India's military power, and use of force in international relations. Before joining ISAS, Dr. Joshi was a MacArthur and Stanton Nuclear Postdoctoral Fellow at the Center for International Security Cooperation at Stanford University, United States. He is also an alumnus of summer workshop on the analysis of military operations and strategy at Columbia University and International Nuclear History Boot Camp Woodrow Wilson Center. He has a doctorate in international politics from Jawaharlal Nehru University, something Dr. Joshi and I share in common. And he has also co-authored 3 books, India and Nuclear Asia, Forces, Doctrines, Dangers, Asia's Emerging Balance of Power, the US Pivot and Indian Foreign Policy, and India's Nuclear Policy, a short introduction. He has extensively published in A-star journals like Survival, Asian Security, India Review, US Naval War College Review, International Affairs, Contemporary Security Policy, Diplomacy and Statecraft, International History Review, and Harvard Asia Quarterly. You can see Dr. Joshi has a very strong CV and has written extensively on subject that we are discussing today. And I'm sure you all are looking forward to hearing him. Dr. Joshi, all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Mishra. Really appreciate this opportunity. Thanks to the Institute of India-Australia Engagement. First of all, can you hear me, Chris? Hello.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. So just wanted to express my gratitude for this wonderful opportunity and for to speak on such an important topic as we approach the 75th year of India's independence. The fundamental contention of my short presentation is basically that the strategic environments in which democracies function is as important as is the internal robustness which democratic political systems exhibit. To put it shortly, to practice democracy, you have to fundamentally preserve it first. And there is where we come down to Australia-India relationship in a sense, but also it is fundamentally linked to India's strategic environment. particularly in the last 15 years. In his address to the nation during the celebrations of India's 75th Independence Day, Prime Minister Narendra Modi told the Indian citizens that the entire world is looking at every development in India, big or small, with deep interest, hope, and expectations. Anxiety rather than hope, however, clouds how India looks at the world. Perhaps for the first time, India confronts the most difficult external environment in its history as an independent republic. When the Indian state was debating its democratic future in the Constituent Assembly debates in the 1940s, its strategic environment was extremely benign. India could opt for non-alignment on Nehru's shoulders, but much of it was also because the Commonwealth ruled the waves in the Indo-Pacific, followed by democratic liberal great powers such as the US. Today, much of India's strategic anxiety engenders out of one singular development, both in its immediate neighborhood and in contemporary international politics, and that is rise of China, and principally for three reasons. First, it's the first time in India's history that New Delhi confronts a hostile great power in its immediate neighborhood. It has never happened in India's history. Even during the Cold War, India was not only geographically distant, but also held no fundamental clash of interest, both material or ideological, with great powers, whether the US or the USSR. China's rise has brought both a dangerous great power, but the dangers of great power politics at India's doorstep. And the clash is both material and ideological. Second, India's growth in the global system occurred during a period of liberal order characterized by American unipolarity. The American policy of benign altruism not only streamlined India's integration in the global economic order, but it also helped streamline relations with countries like Japan and Australia. It would not have happened without the US anchor in that sense. But it also helped India to rise up in the global ladder, particularly with the Indo-US nuclear deal and India's acceptance as a de facto nuclear power. Today, New Delhi confronts an era of deglobalization and protectionism, which complicates its economic fortunes. Its rise in global governance is also fundamentally compromised by China's increasing influence, whether it is the NSG or the UN Security Council. The third most important development in some sense is this current strategic flux is creating new fault lines and engendering new alliances. The emerging balance of power is fracturing old relationships and engendering new alignments of interest, ideologies, and policies, most visible in the emerging Eurasian bloc of authoritarian and military-dominated regimes in Russia, China, and Pakistan, and the maritime democracies such as the US, Australia, India, who are also actively courting many European countries to join their balancing coalition. This external strategic environment basically tells us a lot about why two Commonwealth countries, which were bonded together at their birth, have now found their relationship much more stronger after almost 60 years of their existence in some sense. And that fundamentally relates to the idea of preserving democracies is as important as practicing it. First, the rule of law requires preponderance of power. Rule of law cannot be practiced without preponderance of power. And when we talk about the rule of law in Indo-Pacific, it is fundamentally compromised because the balance of power is fundamentally changing in some sense or being contested upon. Both Australia and India understand that they thrived under a liberal order, a euphemism for American preponderance, if you will. Any change in this balance of power fundamentally threatens their security and economic well-being. Much of this balance of power or great power contestation is actually taking place in the Indo-Pacific. And India and Australia's engagement or alignment in the last 10 years is fundamentally shaped by this balance of power contestation. And we have visited a decisive shift in the military engagement between the two countries, starting with the naval exercises in 2015, followed by Air Force and Army exercises in 2017 and 2018. And they have grown both in complexity and intensity. The quadrilateral naval exercises with the participation of Australia has regained the historical significance. And we will see that defense relationship actually growing by leaps and bounds as we see this balance of power contestation becoming highly competitive. The second very important aspect of this new strategic relationship is that both New Delhi and Canberra gained enormously during the golden age of globalization in the last 30 years. Both also assumed that greater economic integration and interdependence will help them create important issue linkages and leverages to mold and shape China's power. China's economic rise fueled its military appetite. Its power has also allowed her to use economic interdependence for economic coercion. The COVID-19 pandemic actually shattered the belief that economic interdependence will be able to control or to put limits on China's policies. Australia faced a barrage of economic sanctions for its role in calling for greater scrutiny on the origins of COVID-19 pandemic. India was besieged in gray zone operations across the Himalayan frontiers. As Asia's two largest economies, a free and open Indo-Pacific requires greater economic linkages between these countries to reduce their dependence and eliminate the probability of coercive pressure. And that's what we are seeing, that economic relationship is now taking as much precedence as the strategic partnership is important. And that's because it has a strategic angle to it. Lastly, the battle for Indo-Pacific is also in its peripheries. The third most important aspect of free and open Indo-Pacific is to create capacities and capabilities in the smaller states and island states so that to avoid political and economic pressure, particularly the diplomacy of BRI. And I think, as has been outlined by a number of speakers before, that cooperation in whether in connectivity, whether in providing technological solutions, whether on infrastructure, there is a shared vision, which even was outlined in the shared vision on maritime cooperation during the June 2020 summit between the two leaders. That idea of allowing stronger regional institutions and building that resilience within the Indo-Pacific community to kind of shield themselves from greater influence, both politically, economically, as well as strategically. That is what binds India and Australia. So it's the balance of power, it's the need to avoid economic coercion, and it's to keep the smaller states, particularly the island states in Southeast Asia, beyond the influence of China. That is what is driving, in some sense, the Australia-India relationship. And much of that will depend upon fundamentally the great power contestation between India and between US and China, but also China's behavior in a sense. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Dr. Joshi, thank you. Thank you very, very much for your presentation. And you have again highlighted some of the key challenges that not only India, Australia, but also the other democracies, liberal democracies face in the Indo-Pacific. And you have talked about the Malabar exercises, the naval cooperation between Australia and India. And you've also touched upon India's very complex and challenging relationship with China and how it plays in the overall equation of the Indo-Pacific stratagem as it evolves bit by bit. And you have very rightly highlighted again, like our previous esteemed speakers, that the way Australia-India bilateral relationship is deepening, it is also helping their cause at the strategic level, especially in the Indo-Pacific, where all democracies are trying to establish a rule of law, a stable, secure international order, regional order in the Indo-Pacific. So thank you very, very much once again for your remarks. And now it's my pleasure to invite Professor Sean Starr as the next Professor Starr is an associate professor and associate dean at Jindal Global Law School. He's also the executive director of the Center for Sports Law, Business and Governance, and the executive director, Center for India-Australia Studies at the O.P. Jindal Global University. Professor Starr has worked in India for over 10 years, and he has been running his own advisory practice there. And he has advised numerous organizations in Australia in expanding their business into India. Professor Starr is a qualified lawyer and has worked at top-tier law firms in Australia and India. And he was named one of the top 30 people to watch in the business of law by Asia Law Portal. Professor Starr is also co-founder and former chair of the Australia-India Youth Dialogue. And he has been working very closely with DFAT over the years. Professor Starr, like many of us, is also a cricket tragic. And he has advised the Afghanistan Cricket Board, and he has been a senior operation manager at the Indian Premier League and with a law firm as well. Professor Starr convenes a number of subjects: sports law and governance, the law of torts and consumer protection, legal research methodologies, comparative Australia studies at the General Global Law School. He has a lot of interest, including sports law and governance, esports, anti-doping, and Australia and their relationship. And he's also authored a very incisive book, Australia and India, a comparative overview of the law and legal practice. Professor, all yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mishra. I hope I'm audible to everyone in the room and everyone online as well. It's a pleasure to be here in person in Brisbane and to connect with friends and colleagues across the Indian Ocean as well. I want to start, as I do many of my law classes, with a question, just to mix things up a bit, if that's all right, Mr. Chair next to me. I want to ask people, participants online or in the room, if you know that there are 3 Indians who have received the highest civilian honor, the Honorary Order of Australia medal. 3 Indians. Does anyone know who those 3 Indians are in India? One of them more recently, a couple of years ago, but there's been 3. So Nick has said Sachin Tendulkar, and that is correct. He was the 2nd recipient. I think Julia Gillard went over and sort of awarded him that at Wankhede Stadium, if memory serves me correctly. Obviously for his contribution to cricket, probably amongst other things. The more recent one was Kiran Majumdar-Shaw for her contribution to the bilateral business ties. But the first ever recipient in India of an Order Australia was a lawyer by the name of Soli Sorabji. And it's important that we remember the legacy of Soliji, who recently passed away, as one of the pioneers of the Australia-India legal bilateral relationship, connecting the bar councils. He was Attorney General of India for a period of time, and he's done a lot for the Australia-India legal relationship. Now, I think it's quite telling that of these 3 very big names in India, the first ever individual conferred the Order of Australia in India is a lawyer. And today here we're talking about Australia-India legal issues in the context of constitutional democracy. So to me, that's a big signal about the shared values and the connection that we share from a legal perspective. And it was another great lawyer from our country, Justice Michael Kirby, who said in 1990, when he addressed an audience of lawyers and barristers and policymakers in New Delhi, he was talking to these individuals about a small country called Australia and the shared values that we have from a legal perspective. And he said, and I quote, "Australian lawyers do not know enough about India. I warrant the opposite is also true." And I think it's probably still remains true 30 or so years later, that Australians do not know enough about the Indian legal system and vice versa. And that's why this dialogue is very healthy and very important, that we're doing it on essentially Constitution Day and talking about what our Deputy High Commissioners said earlier today, this really fundamental shared value that we have from the perspective of our shared constitutional values and our shared legal values. In fact, as a not that I do this every morning, but this morning I was reading the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, and right there up front at the beginning of paragraph 3, it says the CSP is based on mutual understanding, trust, common interests, and the shared values of democracy and rule of law. We clearly have this foundational pillar, or as Michael said earlier, this central tenet, which has become a shared value of our 2 great democracies and our 2 great nations. And despite that, I'll quote Michael Kirby again. He says the fact that we have these shared values and that we don't know enough about each other is quite tragic and puzzling. So there's a lot of learning that we have to do with each other in terms of our legal and shared values from a constitutional democracy perspective. And I think it's something unique that India and Australia have that we don't necessarily have with some of our other larger economic partners. And we should really embrace this central tenet, this pillar that we have in terms of our constitutional democracies. To give a little bit of I don't intend to give a history lesson per se, but there what is similar about our legal systems? Obviously, we're both common law systems. We sort of extol the virtues of the separation of powers, independent judiciaries. We promote the rule of law. English is a common language in our legal systems, which is also critical for our understanding across India and Australia. We are, of course, pluralist democracies. We have parliamentary constitutions. And another interesting one, we both, yet in our own ways, protect fundamental rights and constitutional guarantees. Now, this is important, and I've recently sort of been dwelling on this last point, because I sort of emphasize and have from the beginning that we have a lot to learn from each other. We're both relatively young constitutional democracies. As Dr. Mishra said early on, India's constitution is about 50 years younger than Australia's constitution. Yet we have a lot that we can learn from each other. In fact, India's constitution actually borrowed certain provisions. Literally almost the text of our trade and commerce clauses is identical. Some of the taxation clauses are almost identical. And as a consequence, the Supreme Court of India has actually referred to judgments of Australia's High Court. Our Supreme Court has got our High Court in Australia. And actually the jurisprudence, the constitutional jurisprudence in India has evolved into its own, but it's borrowed a bit of the language from Australia's as well. But at the same time, despite being the older constitution, and despite having a much more developed jurisprudence, that is to say, the court has evolved its understanding of our constitutional values at 50 years longer to do so. I feel that Australia can learn a lot from India's constitution and its constitutional processes and institutions as well. And just to give you one example, that last point that I mentioned, we both protect the rights of our citizens. We both have enshrined constitutional values, but we've done it in very different ways. In Australia, we only have about four or five express constitutional guarantees, human rights that are expressly in our constitution. We have a couple of implied guarantees as well. But India's got a whole chapter 3 of its constitution devoted to fundamental rights. And in many respects, India sets an example to Australia on how to protect, at least how to enshrine these constitutional guarantees. And these differences are there probably for three main reasons. India had another 50 years for its constitutional values to evolve. Perhaps in 1901, the framers of our constitution in Australia had a very different mindset than in the late 40s when India's constitution was being drafted. Of course, India was coming out of a colonial rule and wanted to ensure that it had protections for its citizens after what it had endured. So the different context and the mindset of the drafters of the constitution was different. But another interesting thing is our constitution in India is much more dynamic and flexible. In Australia, we've had some 8 amendments to the constitution since 1901, and there's been 42 attempts, I think, because we need a referendum to change our constitution. In India, there's been 125 attempts to amend the constitution, and 105 of them have been successful. So there's been 105 changes since 1950. So you can see that fluidity and flexibility is a big point of difference, and it's allowed India to actually increase the amount of rights in its constitution, including the fundamental right to education, for example, more recently. And finally, India's actually had quite a progressive judiciary, quite a progressive decision makers in their courts. We've seen quite recently, India's judges have sort of interpreted the rights that are there in the constitution quite broadly. So the right to human dignity, for example, has been interpreted to include the right to privacy quite recently. India's Supreme Court also, before it was enacted as a fundamental right in the constitution, interpreted a fundamental right to education to exist in India as well. Whereas our courts have often, although there's been some implied rights interpreted, our courts in Australia have been a little bit more conservative, and the scope of our rights has not been interpreted as broadly as the Indian Supreme Court. So I think the intention of the framers of our constitutions, the mindset of the judiciary, And of course, the fluidity and flexibility of our constitution have made our constitutional democracies evolve and change shape in very different ways when it comes to protecting the rights of individuals. Of course, in India, the evolution of public interest litigations has also had a big, a big impact on rights in India. But so I wanted to take a bit of a different tangent and mention that although we have this very important and critical, you could argue, shared value of constitutional democracies and respecting the rule of law, we both have approached our constitutions and the interpretation of our constitutions quite differently since they have evolved or since they were framed by the original drafters. That being said, the fact that we do uphold the rule of law and do have constitutional protections and constitutional institutions should be embraced, and we should see that as a very important part of our relationship. And I note when I was reading the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership this morning, that one of the sort of chapters or subheadings, if I can call it, is public administration and governance, and it talks about working together to evolve and improve and shape these public institutions, and that really govern our constitutional democracy. So I think we'll see a lot more cooperation in this space. Us as academics and policymakers and governments have a lot of work to do, I think, in working together to embrace this shared value that our Deputy High Commissioners talked about earlier. So that's it from me. I believe we have one more speaker, but I'll hand it over to Dr. Mishra again. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Sean. You can make when a lawyer is speaking, he straight away starts throwing up a few questions. And you put us right on the spot asking questions. And frankly speaking, I remembered Sachin Tendulkar, but I didn't know who was the first one and who was the third one. And so, but yes, again, thank you very, very much, Sean, for your very, I think, lucid presentation on a different subject from rest of the speakers. And you very nicely have highlighted the characteristics of India's and Australia's constitutions and done a very comparative, it's a very comparative and nice take on some of the similarities that Australia and India have in their constitution. And you have talked about the Bill of Rights and how it's been missing here, and how India has the public interest litigations and a whole lot of other features of the Indian constitution which are not here in Australia. So I think your presentation is something which gives food of thought for many here in Canberra in terms of what all that Australia can learn from India, and also in India, what India can learn in terms of practices. Just this morning, I was listening that Prime Minister Scott Morrison has introduced the religious discrimination bill in the Parliament, and so these are some of the key features of any liberal democracy, and these are the issues which are being debated around the world. And this is another topic which has always been a hot potato in India. So so this is what democracy is all about, not the best form of government, but the least bad form of government, I would say, democracy that is. Ladies and gentlemen, now I'm very pleased to share that the technical glitch that we have had initially with Ms. Lalita Kumar Mangalam has been sorted. She has joined us, and it's my profound pleasure to invite Ms. Lalita Kumar Mangalam. And she comes at the right time because Sean's presentation very nicely dovetails into what she brings to the table. Ms. Lalita Kumar Mangalam is the director of India Foundation and former chairperson of National Commission for Women. She's been a senior BJP member and an expert on women's issues regarding health, development, education rights, accesses, etc. She's a prominent woman political leader from a major backward class in Tamil Nadu, the Kongu Villar. She's also a social worker and has worked in health, development, HIV/AIDS prevention, and advocacy. She has worked with marginalized and disempowered communities, especially with women, truckers, sex workers, LGBTQ community, migrant workers, construction workers, disabled women. She is represented and consulted for various state and national government programs with the UNDP, UNICEF, UNAIDS, Natural AIDS Control Organization, USAID, AUSAID, and a whole lot of other international organizations. In the past, she has contested 3 times from Tripur, Tiruchirappalli, and Pondicherry. She is fluent not only in Hindi, but also in Tamil and Bengali. Ms. Kumar Mangalam holds a Bachelor of Economics from St. Stephen's, Delhi University, and Master in Business Administration from Madras University. So we have 2 speakers here from St. Stephen's today. And she's also the founder member of chairperson of Prakriti Trust. She comes from a very known Kumar Mangalam's family, and the Kumar Mangalams have donated more than 55,000 acres of land for the Bhudan movement. Some of you would know this movement, and almost all their land holdings to local farmers in Tamil Nadu. Her family has more than 100 years of socio-political legacy. They fought against the British, and her family members have served as chief ministers, governors, cabinet ministers, army generals, ambassadors, and members of parliament. Her own late brother, P. Kumar Mangalam, was a member of parliament. Mr. Kumar Mangalam is also director in charge of Center for Religion and Society and the Center for Public Diplomacy and Soft Power. You can see we are very delighted and honored to have Ms. Kumar Mangalam with us this afternoon. Ms. Kumar Mangalam, all yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon and good morning, because it's still quite early here in India. My apologies for joining late, but technical glitches are beyond everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this panel and for that fantastic introduction. I have sort of listened to what has been said by the earlier speaker, so I won't repeat it. But based on my experience, not only with working with women, but in working with marginalized communities, and that is across the board, let me talk about why the role of a constitutional democracy is so important in especially the emerging post-COVID world order. We are all very well aware that there's a huge amount of unrest which is happening throughout the world, whether people are living in democracies or people are living in countries which not really are free and fair in terms of the constitution. We have people questioning the need for the vaccine that most of us, I think, would have taken. We have people questioning the way governance is being conducted. We have people even questioning the role of the judiciary. Now, according to me, questioning is always very correct, because unless we question the status quo, as times change, as people change, as the population's density or even the makeup of the population changes, we have to be more flexible. There are, of course, limits also and limitations to a constitutional democracy. But the fact remains that ultimately, unless there is a form of participation from the general population, regardless of their religion or their economic or their social or even educational status, countries often end up being, all about those who have the power and those who don't. As the speaker before me pointed out, India's is a very vibrant constitution. It's also very adaptable. Forgive me if that's not exactly the right word to use. But as he pointed out, we've had an enormous number of amendments. 105 have gone through, and I think about 20 or 22 more were attempted. Some of those amendments I remember very clearly, because in the early 1970s, when my father was a member of Indira Gandhi's cabinet, some very controversial amendments were brought in by him, introduced by him. He was a lawyer, a brilliant speaker. So he mostly defended these on behalf of the government. One of which was the nationalization of coal mines. The other was the nationalization of banks. And the third, of course, was the Privy Purses Amendment Bill, where our erstwhile royal rulers, the Rajas, etc., most of their properties, landed properties, were taken over by the government, and they were given what was called privy purses. I think you can call them sort of being given a compensation for what was taken over by the state. Now, of those amendments, some have lasted the test of time, some have not. But as I said, we continue to be a very responsive and dynamic constitution. One of the things that has always impressed me, despite the fact that there have been many criticisms about it, is the fact that in the Constituent Assembly, India's constitution was drafted by a Constituent Assembly which had 389 members. Out of those, only 14 were women. But each of those 14, despite not having a majority vote, I mean, let's be frank, 14 is nothing out of 389, not even 10%. I think less than 5%. But they still, each of them had brought to the table their own individual experiences, their own individual voices, their own individual concerns. For example, there was a lady called Dakshayani Velayudham. She was the only person from the most backward community in those days, which is the Dalit community, what we call the most impoverished, the most in terms of socioeconomic background also, the most backward. And she was determined that, that what we call in India has reservation in many of her government jobs, in educational institutions, etc. She was one of the main people who was responsible for that actually being even brought into the constitution and into what are the fundamental rights and the directive principles. The directive principles of India's constitution are very important because that is what gives us literally the direction for whatever steps or whatever fundamental principles we want to have enshrined in that, the holy grail, so to speak, of our democracy. And there were other women who talked about the fact that inclusion, not just in terms of caste, but also in terms of gender, etc., were equally important. Today, as you know, India has come way ahead. In the last 75 years, women have become much more independent. There are many avenues for equality that women have been able to access, though we still have a long way to go. But women's equality throughout the world is, too many of us who've been working for the last 40 years, sometimes in moments of frustration, I say it's just a pipe dream. But the actuality is the fact that when women who are called on, even panels like this, where we say very frankly that in a constitutional democracy, all citizens of a particular country must be given equal opportunity, equal rights, equal space to be able to express their opinions, equal freedoms, for want of a better word, itself is a huge step forward. One of the biggest differences between Australia and India is just the sheer volume of population. We have 1.39 billion counting people, and the variety of not just religions, the variety of so much social and economic differences. And I don't mean differences always in a negative manner, but also in a very positive manner, is what makes India probably the most unique country in the world. We are probably, and I say this with almost 100% certainty, the only country in which every religion you can think of in the world coexists. Despite a lot of the negative publicity that I think is partly, a carryover from 900 years of being ruled by people who are not actually from this part of the world, about India being unresponsive, about us being bigoted religiously, except with regard to religion, caste, etc. I would like to say that the amount of change I have seen in my lifetime is remarkable. The fact that, I come from a caste that is supposed to be backward caste, and I use the word supposed very, very sort of deliberately. I don't think anybody in my family is backward. We're all extraordinarily well educated. We all have positions of influence, so to speak. And the women in our family have actually, we laughingly say that we have done better than the men on an average. And this is not because of, and this cannot be not because of want of opportunity. We have never been held back. There are many families like this in India. And you will find success stories, remarkable success stories of women, of people from the LGBT community, of people from, poorer communities, marginalized communities who have come up with the most remarkable success stories. Recently, we had a massive IPO, that is the initial public offering, the listing of a company called Paytm, which has taken on giants like Google, and made one of the is one of the biggest success stories of India's emerging democracy, or what we call New India. the man who founded that company, was not from a very affluent or from a very well-known background. He came from an ordinary, very ordinary background and has managed to make a huge success of himself. Like this, there are many, many stories. Today, recently, for example, this morning, I read about this young lady who's 34 years old, whose husband was in the army, who was martyred. Today, she has, or rather that was yesterday, the news came out today, she has become an officer in the Indian Army. And, this is only because India today is really a country that is looking forward. In a sense, of course, we are competing with everybody else in the world, but that's, I think, a very human tendency. But also we are competing with ourselves, in a sense, to see that we become better, that we grow more equally. And the basis for all of that is our constitution. The founding fathers of this country, the 389-member Constituent Assembly, were remarkably forward-looking and far-seeing. They have, one of the biggest advantages of our constituency is what the gentleman before me said, that it is extremely flexible. We are a parliamentary democracy, and I'm not saying that Parliament always gets everything right, but the fact that every 5 years, the whole of India gets to choose those who will rule us. And again, I say we don't always do everything exactly right. We do make mistakes, but I think being human is to make mistakes. But we also have the capacity to, especially today, and 75 years is very, very young in any country's history. We are a very, very ancient civilization, I think beyond 5,000, 10,000 years old. In 75 years, we have moved so far forward from what we were when we started as a democracy, when we became a free country, so to speak, that it is remarkable. And I think that any country must have a constitution that backs freedom. The directive principles of India's constitution are very, very clear that it is the citizens of this country who eventually should be able to or must have a very loud, a very clear voice in the shaping of how this country is governed. Governance in every country can be hit and miss, and that's regardless of whether we are a democracy or not. Autocracies often end up being rules and regulations and even the way of life being controlled by a small minority. We look at merely, often throughout the world, we look merely at economics as the basis of happiness or as the basis of progress. But in a world today where we are facing environmental problems, I mean, this year, I think throughout the world, we've had floods. Australia has. My part of India, which is South India, Tamil Nadu, is having torrential rains, and we are having floods in many places. It has a very big coastline, so there are lots of low-lying areas too there. London had floods. Many parts in China that we know of and we were informed of have had serious floods. People have died, I think, at the floods there, and in many other countries. The United States has. Canada had temperatures beyond 61 degrees centigrade, which is somewhere up north, I think in British Columbia, which is unheard of. So when we are battling things like problems as huge as environmental pollution and the environment itself turning around on us, Mother Nature telling us that, come on, back off, you all have done enough. Now we need to live together. Both India's ancient, sense, which is reflected in our constitution, very strongly reflected in it, that nature and humans must coexist. Our culture, I'm not talking about any particular religion. If you go into the depth of it, you will see that in every religion that's practiced in India, regardless of where those religions were born, where the inception of those religions were, there is a very definite respect for Mother Nature. We call our country's mother. It's Mother Earth, it's Mother Nature. India is always represented by a woman. If you see in our cultural books, in our school textbooks, etc. And the fact is that every child that is born in this country, regardless of any differences that may be there between them, has the opportunity to develop today to their own full potential. Yes, there are limitations, but where aren't there limitations? And the fact that this is all backed by a very, very strong constitutional democracy is something that makes me very proud. Australia too. I have to admit I'm not an expert on Australia's democracy, nor am I a lawyer, so I can't argue as effectively as the gentleman who spoke before me. But as a woman, and a woman from a backward community, a woman who has seen that equal opportunity has enabled me to, in a sense, fulfill many of my own dreams, to be able to fight for the dreams and for the equal opportunity, equal access that every woman dreams of in this world, regardless of where we are born, etc. This fills me with a certain amount of gratification also to the makers of our constitution. And it also in me, well, it sort of hardens, for want of a better word, the belief. It makes my belief much more firm that without a certain amount of democracy, or at least full democracy, given the fact that I'm Indian and I'm used to a very, very democratic country where most of us say what we want whenever we want. And despite all the negative publicity that goes on, there is really almost no reprisal in terms of what we say. There are intellectuals, there are comics, there are actors, there are singers, there are artists, everybody. We have the freedom to say what we want, sometimes very irresponsibly, I accept. But the fact that we can actually, and we do live in this growing, very, very multicultural, very, very diverse democracy. And this is only possible because our constitution is so strongly for a democratic society, that I very strongly believe that going forward into this new post-COVID world order, people's participation, regardless of where they are from, regardless of their backgrounds, all other differences, just regardless, is the most important thing that will help us to evolve both as a society, come to terms with the problems that we face as individuals, as countries, as societies, etc., and be able to, take humankind forward, for want of a better word. In India, we don't measure progress merely by money. We are very spiritual, again, I say, regardless of all differences. And all religions that are practiced in India, despite the fact that there are many differences often between people who practice different religions, all religions have a certain amount of spirituality in them. If you see the practicing Christians, if you see the practicing Muslims, if you see the practicing Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, Sikhs, I mean, we have an enormous amount of religions. I don't want to go into the detail, it'll take up too long. All of our the religions practiced here have a fair amount of spirituality, which is what will, I think, eventually help us through these most troubled times, along with industrial and progress, along with the progress of IT, along with, and I sometimes don't know if it's going to be exactly the right thing or not, the incipient, whether it's threat or the expectation that artificial intelligence will soon take over the world. The concept and the practice of spirituality, of going beyond merely the economics of it, and what we see, the physical manifestation of life as we see and know and practice it, is what I think will keep humankind going. In all of this, again, and I repeat this, I'm sorry if I sound ad nauseum sort of, but in all of this, the participation of every single individual, whether it's a child, whether it's an infant, whether it's a young adult or an older person, every individual who has the capacity, the permission, and the ability to be able to participate in eventually, perhaps not directly, but certainly indirectly, in the governance of a country, or in how the country moves along, not just in terms of governance, but in many other ways, socio-culturally too, not just politically, is probably the best foundation for the future. And I think I'll stop at that. I know I've not painted exactly only a rosy picture, but my belief in any constitution and any fundamentally free, any fundamentally democratic constitution is unshakable. Whether it's Australia, whether it's the United States of America, whether it's India, whether it's any other country in the world, I feel that unless individuals, societies, countries, regardless of the differences between us, unless we all have a voice, and an equal voice, regardless of our background, in the shaping of our own country's future and present. Mankind is really doomed. Sorry for ending on a rather gloomy note, but the fact that human beings themselves are still evolving, that is what will eventually be the real basis for the shaping of our future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Ms. Kumar Mangalam. And it's always a blooming delight listening to you. And we have heard you so many times on the TV, and we always enjoy your presentations. And you have very nicely dissected some of the aspects of the Indian Constitution, and also very kindly shared your own experiences of working with the marginalized communities, especially with women. And you also very, I think, nicely highlighted some of the challenges that India's democracy and constitution and the functioning faces, and in the process, how India is trying to iron out some of these challenges. And I think I agree with you. The biggest strength any democracy has is the ability to reinvent itself, which is not available with many other regimes. And thank you so much for your presentation, Ms. Kumar Mangalam. And ladies and gentlemen, we have gone past 3:30, but as a chair and moderator, I will just ask for 5 more minutes from you, because we have got a couple of questions which I want to quickly throw to our speakers, and I'll have to put you on the spot by asking you to only in 2 minutes respond to those questions. Professor Joshi, first question is coming to you. All of you can go one by one. Professor Yogesh Joshi, your question to you is, how does India see AUKUS? Second, my question to Michael is, Michael, what are the challenges that you think the bilateral relationship faces, especially post-COVID? And will those challenges be addressed during our negotiations for CICA and FTA? Lalitaji, quickly to you. Once Mahathir Mohamad came to India, and in the Hindustan Times conclave, he said, too much of democracy sometimes hurts. So what is your view on that? Thank you. Yogesh, you can go first.
I think the fundamental, thanks for the question. I think the fundamental significance of AUKUS basically is that China's assertiveness and aggressiveness will not go unanswered. And it raises major issues for China, whose strategy basically has been to kill the chicken to scare the monkey. The monkey now doesn't want to be scared, the whole strategy is built upon America's fundamental strengths, which are arms and allies. So I think India would not, in any case, India would welcome it. The second important factor is, if it is today Australia, tomorrow it can be India. You never say never in international politics. I think that's a great signal. But the most important aspect of it, as I think about it, is basically that when you think about the defense of the Indo-Pacific, it is not meant, to use basketball's terminology in a sense, it's not man-to-man marking. It's about zonal defense. And if you have Japan, Australia, and India, then you have 3 major zones covered in a sense. And that makes China spend a lot of energy and effort. And the more you make them spend that energy and effort, the better it is for you. So I think, in that sense, I think the greater the strengths of these countries individually, and in some sense collectively, if they reach that point, the better it is for each of their independent security and foreign policies. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm not speaking for India. Nobody can speak for India in a sense. We are more than 1 billion people, and the Indian government would have its own views. But as an analyst, I don't see why India would, would think about it in any other manner, but welcome that. I'll stop.
Thank you, Yogesh. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thanks. I'll just turn my screen back on. Sorry, my technical abilities elude me, and here we go.
right, Michael.
As long as you can hear me, that's the main thing. So what are the challenges that the relationship faces? Obviously, on the theme of democracies, we both face elections this coming year. India, Uttar Pradesh, Australia, federally. All those things have an impact on trade negotiations. I think for Australia, the support for a free trade agreement with India is pretty bilateral. I mean, not bilateral, bipartisan, and I don't see anything really of issue from our side. Though, of course, we're looking at India's politics closely. We saw the changes to the agricultural laws rolled back in India, and while that doesn't directly relate to the negotiations for a CECA, our free trade agreement with India, we know how politically sensitive some market access issues are to Indian communities, particularly in places like Punjab and Uttar Pradesh, which are facing state elections. So, yeah, there's some of the challenges that we'll have to overcome. We're not pessimistic by any means. This will require patience. This would be a big deal to get a free trade agreement over the line. It could take. We're hoping it won't take years, but you never know. But that's just something that we're watching. In terms of other challenges, well, maybe I can leave that to others. Obviously, geopolitical tensions in the region are rising, but we're confident that as like-minded fellow democracies, India and Australia will have each other's best interests at heart.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Lalita ji, before you answer your question, there's one more which has come from Amit Mehta. And he asks you that you feel that more investment is needed in the court system to clear backlog and ensure that rights under the Constitution are more effective. You can respond, and Sean, our fellow panelist, if he wants to respond, you're most welcome.
Can I go first?
Yes, Lalita ji, please do.
All right, yeah. Now to the first question, to the comment of what Mahathir Mohamad said, well, I don't agree with the way he said it, that too much democracy, but I do feel that sometimes people across the board, too indisciplined a democracy can do us more harm than good. People shouldn't forget, nobody should forget that a country must always put, if not 100% of the time, I would say a large percentage of the time, the common good before individual good. And unfortunately, today, politics has become so polarized throughout the world that that bitterness seems to spill over into many of the statements that are made by influencers, for want of a better word. And yes, that is certainly not good for democracy. I'm not saying that these people must be pulled up and jailed, etc., etc. But at the very least, all countries must start, in a way, go back to the basics and start teaching us at a very young age that there is a point where the larger good, especially in a democracy, given the fact that we are not, militarily or ruled by despots, for want of a better word, the fact that we have to each be very consciously aware that individually we are important, yes, certainly, but it is the collective as a country that our strength will be recognized, respected, and that is only if we put the collective good before that of the country. We may have differences politically. We will always have in a democracy. We may have differences in what we feel has even priority in terms of governance, etc. But everybody who has is in a position to influence, and that's why I use the word influencers, must also be politically and in terms of the way they speak, the way they talk about their own country, the way they represent their country at various forums, be responsible. So what is most important is a responsible democracy. I don't think democracies are too much or too little. How can they be? If it's a democracy, it's a democracy. But democracies also have their limits. So we as individuals need to, I think, be more disciplined. And with regard to the second question, yes, we have a huge number of cases pending. I have been for a long time saying that the Indian judicial system really needs a review and it needs reforms. I will be pillarized for saying this. I mean, I'll be really pilloried, not pillarized, sorry. I'll be criticized pretty badly, for want again of a better word, for this. But I come from a legal family. Every generation in my family has had lawyers who made a very good name and a very have an extremely upstanding name at the bar. And I have seen personally that the lack of justice that many marginalized communities have is because, in a sense, justice today in India often seems to be more available to the privileged than to the underprivileged. Our judicial system needs review and needs a lot of change. There has been a lot of change over the years, but yes, we need to we cannot ignore the fact, or should not ignore also the fact, that we have a huge number of undertrials who are languishing in jail, and that really must be dealt with on an almost an emergency basis.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lalita ji. Sean, quick 30 seconds.
Yeah, thanks, Lalita ji. I think you hit the nail on the head there. 3 quick points. The first is that there's no doubt this is a significant challenge. I mean, as you alluded to earlier, 1.39 billion population, cases taking decades. There's a big backlog. Pendency is clearly an issue. And it's difficult to compare this with Australia because in many respects, it's apples and oranges. However, not only is significant investment required, but my second point is that there's a paradigm shift required from a legal, cultural, and judicial culture perspective. And this is something I think India and Australia can work together well, which is my third point. And it fits in the comprehensive strategic partnership where we talk about public institutions and governance reform, because Australia over the last couple of decades has undergone reform in the context of pendency of cases and how we look at justice in the court system, where we don't just look at justice in Australia as the right decision, reaching the right decision, but it's 3-pronged. It's the correct decision, a speedy resolution, and an affordable and cheap dispute resolution option. And I think with those 3 priority and these 3 focuses, the Australian courts have been able to focus on case management reform and reduce pendency and increase the speed of dispute resolution. And I think Australia and Indian courts can work together on that very point as well.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Sean. Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's now time to draw curtains because we have overshot our time limit by 14 minutes. And you will agree that the quality of discussion has been so fascinating that I could not help borrow another 14 minutes from your precious time. So thank you very, very much for your indulgence again. And on behalf of you all, first of all, I want to thank all our esteemed speakers today. Mrs. Archana Singh, the Honorary Counsel, Government of India, Mr. Sunit Mehta, Deputy High Commissioner, Government of India in Canberra, Mr. Ian Biggs, the Australian Deputy High Commissioner in New Delhi, Mr. Michael Feller, Director, India Political Section, Ms. Lalita Kumar Mangalam from New Delhi, Professor Yogesh Joshi from Singapore, and of course, Sean next to me. Thank you all very, very much for your time and your sharing your views and perspectives today and enriching this webinar, which is celebrating Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. I also want to thank the Indian High Commission for joining hands with us in organizing and hosting this fascinating event. Thank you all very, very much on behalf of Indian High Commission as well. Also, a big thank you to Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for joining hands with us. And this is one of the many events that we would be doing in the future as India celebrates its 75th year of independence. Similarly, I also thank Jindal Global University and India News for their support in organizing this event, ladies and gentlemen. And most of all, I want to thank our IT team here, Agastya, Sid, Lily, and also in India, Dhruv and Vidyut, and others at Jindal Global University who have been working with us this very challenging first time hybrid event. And despite of the initial glitches, I think we have pulled it off very well. So thank you to the IT team. And I want to thank each one of you for coming here, sparing time to join us this afternoon. and you can already smell the wonderful masala chai and the lovely food. And I'm sure you all are very hungry. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming here. And thank you all to presenters and attendees from around the world for joining us this afternoon. Thank you all very much. Have a lovely day and a wonderful weekend.
Bye-bye.